super impressed. I've been working on these vehicles for a long time. The Ecoboost always thrills. Hi, Joe Granatelli here, and today we're with the gang from Riding Revolutions, and we're gonna do a ton of Go Fast goodies on this 2012 F-150 with a 3.5 liter Ecoboost motor. Let me let the cat out of the bag. We're gonna start out and do a baseline run, then we're gonna put an aftermarket on-3 intercooler upgrade, then we're gonna add the Granatelli coils, then we're gonna use our friends from Revolutions Motorsports sent over a cold air intake and a flash tool that I add my own custom tuning to it. And then finally, the guys from MagnaFlow sent over an exhaust system. We're gonna put that on, and you're gonna watch the progression of the power come up. So why don't we jump right into this and do a baseline test. All right, guys, we just made our first pull, and you'll notice on the graph we made 279, almost 280 horsepower and 302 foot-pounds of torque. That's not bad for a stock engine. Remember, this engine is only 214 cubic inches, running about 13 pounds of boost. All right, guys, we just installed the on-3 intercooler, and you'll notice on the graph now we're looking at a 297 horsepower and 314 foot-pounds of torque. In 2.5 hours, we lost a little bit of boost, but that's because we're making the turbo is now becoming more efficient with the intercooler. And now you'll see the air temperature and the boost is much more linear. It stays all the way across. So even by losing about a pound of boost with the larger intercooler, not bad for what we got. As we go to the next level, when we add the coils and then we add the performance tuning, you'll see the big difference in how it really makes a big bump. We just installed the Granatelli coils, and now we're making 324 horsepower, almost 325, and 348 foot-pounds of torque. That's a 27 horsepower increase and 34 foot-pounds of torque. And I know you guys are all saying, no way, no way. I'm gonna explain to you why. Again, the ignition has enough, I call it jigga jam, that's my word for millijoules, okay? The ignition has enough jigga jam or enough power to create that number at the top, but down low, where the engine is at peak torque and peak boost, that's where the stock ignition falls short. And so our ignition, the Granatelli Extreme coils, goes from 45,000 to 80,000 volts output, and that's the reason why we get that extra power down low. So again, our peak power, we're still up 27 and 34 foot-pounds of torque, but wait till you look at this one under the curve. It makes a tremendous amount of power and torque. So let's go over to the graph. And now on this graph, what we're looking at, the intercooler versus the ignition coils. So in the end, I'm gonna show you the stock with all the add-ons. So now what we're looking at, if we look at this curve, is you'll see how linear it is. And again, the torque, I mean, there's just torque everywhere. From 2,500 RPM all the way to peak, the torque pretty much stays solid. Realistically at about 30 to 34 all the way across the board. So if you look at the gap between here and here, for example, this is from 200 to let's say 255, so there's a 55 foot-pounds of torque increase at 2,800, but then in reality it does stay at about 35 all the way across the board. That's a beautiful torque curve. They lay right on top of each other and it just shows it all the way. Same can be said for horsepower. The horsepower improvement is everywhere, from 2,500 all the way up as we climb. And again, also remember, in each case, the power is always 5250, horsepower and torque are crossing regardless. And again, now we look at air-fuel ratio. The reason why it looks the same is because the coils don't change the air-fuel ratio. So that's why, that's again evidencing the fact that it's perfect. And then boost, you'll see that little boost increase, but again, that's basically 0.2 of a pound of boost. So that doesn't make a difference. That's just the graph picking up individual things. So your horsepower and your torque increases with the Granatelli coils are 27 horsepower, 34 foot-pounds of torque. I mean, what more can we say? It's awesome. Let's go on to the next thing. Now we're gonna do that big jump is gonna be our Revolutions Motorsports cold air intake and the flash tool with the Granatelli tune. We just got done installing the Revolutions Motorsports cold air intake as well as the flash tool with our custom tune. And now we went to 388 horsepower and 455 foot-pounds of torque. 455. Really, you might as well call it 456 because it's 0.9. This is a 214 cubic inch engine making 456 foot-pounds of torque so far. That's a gain of 64 horsepower and 107 foot-pounds of torque with an air intake and a reflash. That's tremendous. Now again, that's not the total gain, that's the gain over what we just made with the coils. You'll notice our torque went from 245 all the way up to 410. So that's tremendous difference down low. We're talking over 150 foot-pounds of torque at 2,800. That's awesome. And again, look at the power. The horsepower goes just perfectly linear all the way up. So you'll see before and after the extra, the reason why I haven't got there yet is the boost. But you're gonna see that we increased our boost, and that correlates to an increase in horsepower of about 64, 65 horsepower just everywhere from the beginning all the way to the end, which is gonna make this car drive phenomenal. When you're in this, when you're driving the truck down the road, it's gonna have so much bottom end grunt, or what's called tip-in throttle. When you just barely tip into the gas, this is gonna pull away. So before, if you were going up a hill or you wanted to pass somebody, you might give it like a 30% increase in throttle. Now we're gonna do like maybe 10% increase in throttle, and it's just gonna lunge and surge forward. It's gonna be so smooth. You're gonna love the way this truck runs. And let's talk about boost. So now I'm gonna click over here on boost. You'll see here we're back to boost, and it says 55, but now we're zooming in, so we're making it easier to read. So look at our difference, these two burgundy lines right here. This was stock, which was about, you'll see 13.3 with a peak of, let's see here, our peak went up to about 14, 13.7, but now look at our boost is perfectly linear, and we're making upwards of 17, we made a little over 17.2 pounds of boost, but linear, it's making 16 pounds all the way along the line. So from 3,900 all the way to 6,000, it's making 16 pounds of boost. So the increase of about 3 pounds of boost is what yields our 65 horsepower increase, but also that's why we're seeing over 150 foot-pounds of torque as low as 2,800. Now, I mean, I'm impressed with that number. And again, looking at the air-fuel ratio, you'll see with our reflash, I was able to make the engine just a little bit richer. So I'll go to air-fuel. Now I'll zoom in on that. We'll make that, let's say 25. Now you'll see this was before, and now you'll see with my tune in there. So from the beginning to the end, we're from 12.8 to 12.5 to 1 air-fuel ratio, which again, we can get away with that because we have direct injection. We've now made a few changes, and if you're doing the math in your head, you're gonna see we're well over 100 horsepower and we're well over 150 foot-pounds of torque, and we haven't even installed the exhaust yet. So our last step is gonna be to put that MagnaFlow exhaust on here to get that really throaty sound, and let's see what kind of big numbers we make. All right, guys, we just put the MagnaFlow exhaust on, and another 26 horsepower and 33 foot-pounds of torque. It just goes to show how that stock exhaust system is really plugging up these turbos. So now we made a final number of 414.6 horsepower, 488 foot-pounds of torque. Now remember, this is a long drive shaft, which means we're probably losing about 18% drivetrain loss. So what happens is that the transmission, automatic transmission, that eats power, and the driveline, that also eats power. So what we're talking about, if we just calculated an 18% loss, this engine now at I did the calculation. 414 horsepower is equivalent to 496 horsepower at the crank, and the torque goes from 488 is actually, that real number is 560 foot-pounds of torque. So I know a lot of you guys, when you saw the original base number, you said, hey, this truck makes 365 horsepower stock. Well, it might make 365 stock, but what it really made is it made 280 at the tire. If you do the math, you see that's about 18%. Now we're just, for fun, we're giving that number back. So we're showing you what the engine's really making versus what you're benefiting at the rear wheels. And again, make no mistake about it, even with the loss, we've now gained 135 horsepower and 186 foot-pounds of torque from stock until these modifications. So 135 horsepower, 186 foot-pounds of torque with an intercooler upgrade, Granatelli coils, liver noise air intake, liver noise flash tool with a Granatelli tune, and finally, the MagnaFlow exhaust. That's a lot of power and a lot of torque for a day's work. Let me show you one last graph. And what this graph is showing you here now, let's just get this stuff out of the way. The green line I've already explained to you is air-fuel ratio. You'll see it's exactly the same. That's because the exhaust doesn't change air-fuel ratio. The boost is almost identical. Let me go back now to 45. Let me go to 55. So I brought that line down, and you'll see these lines are literally over the top of each other because the exhaust didn't change the boost. What it did do is got rid of that restriction in the exhaust, and now you'll see the gain. So now let's look at the horsepower gain. Again, down low, it's pretty much the same, and that's because when you don't have a lot of boost, the stock exhaust is probably pretty close. But the more boost you make, the more back pressure you build, the more you want to benefit from that increased exhaust flow. And you'll see, once again, as soon as the boost came in, boom, we start making a horsepower increase. The same thing with torque. Look at that torque. Again, got to talk about it. Torque under the curve. So at 3,200, we went from 405 all the way up to 455. We picked up 50 foot-pounds of torque at 3,200 RPM. That's where you're driving it. Nobody drives these engines at 6,000. So we get the big number at the top. We want to talk about what's usable power. It's the 6-cylinder, and those make their usable power between really 1,800 and about 3,500. And in that spot, you'll see at 3,500, that's where we made all of our gains. So the last thing I'm going to show you now is that big dramatic number. I'm going to show you the stock graph versus the total gain. Okay, what we're looking at here, let's talk about the blue line because that's just super duper impressive. This is the stock torque, and this is with all the performance increase. So our peak torque is 186 foot-pounds, but look down low. Again, 3,200 RPM, we went from about 265 foot-pounds to 455. That's 190 foot-pound of torque increase. So when I told you that the peak was 186, we actually make that increase of 186 to 190 from 2,800 all the way to about 5,700. It has that torque everywhere. And of course, horsepower is RPM. So as our RPM goes up, our horsepower goes up, and you'll see here that our horsepower, this is stock horsepower, and you'll see again, now this is with all the modifications, that horsepower. And again, horsepower under the curve. Our peak is great over here, but again, even down here, as low as let's say 2,800, we've gone from, we'll call it 100 horsepower. So 125 horsepower increase, 2,800 RPM. And our max horsepower is 135. So we basically went from 125 to 135 throughout the entire power curve. That's nothing to shake a stick at. Probably about $4,000 worth of go fast parts, but for $4,000, you've picked up 160 horsepower, 188 foot-pounds of torque. We haven't even gone into this engine. The closest thing we got to touching the motor was changing the ignition coils, which was about a 5 to 15 minute job, and we didn't even get our hands dirty. Everything you saw us do today can easily be done in your driveway. Awesome. I want to thank the guys from Revolutions coming out today and spending all this time with us, and I hope you guys are impressed with the results as much as we are. Thank you very much.